Hello, my name is Martin Ugander. I'm professor of cardiac imaging at the University of Sydney, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about clinical research, what it is, why you might want to do it, and how, and a little bit how I think about those things in the setting of embarking upon a medical career. So in summary, what do you want to do? What do you want to do with your life? And it's a question that only you can answer. I can't tell you how to live your life, but I'll be asking you a number of questions throughout this presentation to get you thinking a little bit about what you prefer to do and and if that is related to research, that you might want to choose to pursue a research experience in some description. And secondly, choose your supervisor, not your subject matter. We'll get back to this in detail, but it's absolutely probably the most important decision you make is choosing your supervisor, and not necessarily the subject matter, which sometimes can be something worth thinking about. So a little bit about my background. I was born in Stockholm in Sweden, and as a child moved to the United States, grew up there, went to high school in New Jersey. After high school, I started university studies at McGill University in Montreal in Canada. But then after a year there, I applied to and got admitted to medical school at Lund University back in Sweden. I did my training there and started working as a junior doctor in radiology the last summer of my medical school, because in Sweden that's a possibility to work as a junior doctor before completing medical school. And then I commenced a PhD in clinical physiology at Lund University, followed by a clinical internship at Lund University Hospital. And then I went over to the United States as a postdoctoral researcher at the National Institutes of Health in the NIH in Washington, D.C. in the US. And then after that came back to Sweden, this time to Stockholm, to the Karolinska Institute, where and the Karolinska University Hospital, where I did my clinical specialization, became associate professor, and then more recently was recruited as professor of cardiac imaging to the University of Sydney and moved to Australia. So who gets a PhD? It turns out that we have the MDs and the non-MDs, and there's, without passing any particular judgment, just on a numerical basis, there are much more, a greater number of non-MDs who have a PhD in the medical sciences compared to MDs, even though there are a lot of MDs in several cultures or countries that will pursue research without necessarily getting a PhD. But still, nonetheless, there's a minority there. And there's a little bit of an imbalance in medical schools, and there's discussions in academic institutions about do we have enough medically trained doctors that are also involved in the medical school education, and that medical training and research training go hand in hand as a part of getting involved in teaching. And I just thought you might be aware that there are sort of at least two different types of MDs, and the MDs are of PhDs, and the MDs are a smaller number by comparison. But when we think of the careers that can occur within medicine, I like to think of it as a two-axis system. On the horizontal axis, we have the clinical career, and we've all met during medical school teachers that started, they were the MD, they went on to do clinical internship, and they then did a specialization, became consultants, but they did not do anything on the academic career. On the other hand, we have the academics who might have done their MD, completed medical school, then did a PhD, then done a postdoctoral training, become associate professor and professor, and some of them without doing any clinical work at all. But I identify very much with being in the crosshairs of both, in at least having an MD and at least having a PhD and being a physician scientist. I find it particularly gratifying to combine the academic side of things with the clinical side of things. It's not for everybody, but it's something worth thinking about if you think you might want to get involved in research and also have a clinical career. You might want to reflect on different possibilities you could have in your research, in your career as it progresses. So this is an algorithm that I affectionately call Martin Ugander's meaning of life. And it's sort of, I say that a little bit with a tongue in cheek, but it's sort of how I think a little bit structured about why I do what I do. And if we look at the top of the diagram, I do what I do because it makes me feel good. And I feel good when I'm having fun. And I feel that I'm having fun when I'm making the world a somewhat better place. And in the setting of what I do, that is done by changing the practice of medicine. And the way we change the practice of medicine is changing the guidelines for clinical care and the textbooks. And the way that is done is by exchange of the currency of exchange for science, which is publishing original research articles. And they're done by having done carefully designed studies. And that is the research component of what we do. However, that's not the only thing we do. We have, in academic medicine, we have research, we have the clinical space, we have teaching, and we have giving back and informing and giving service to the community. And there's an amazing synergy between these four pillars of what we do. I can't tell you the number of times and the amount of satisfaction it has given that we've had a clinical problem. This and this patient presents with this and that problem, and we don't know what to do. And then the second time a patient like that comes around, you start thinking, wait a minute, I've seen patients like this, and we don't know what to do here. How could we figure out what to do? And they say, well, maybe we could design a study and study such patients that fulfill these particular criteria. So we design a study, ultimately publish an article, change the guidelines and change the practice of medicine, and then go full circle back to the clinical scenario sometime later, often years later, where we sit and say, wow, this is the kind of patient that we saw a number of years ago, didn't know what to do with them, but thanks to the science that we did and the research and the publications and the changing of the practice of medicine, we now know what to do. And that's an immensely gratifying feeling to see that. And I've had the fortunate opportunity to follow that loop a number of times in my career. And it's just so tremendously satisfying to influence the future of how things are done by changing that future. On the other hand, we have teaching. I often think of the teaching experience as being both gratifying, but also challenging. The most difficult question typically comes from the junior doctor or novice medical student, and it's that first question that, wait a minute, excuse me, but how does that actually work, that thing that you're talking about? And when it comes to that, often the question is we don't know. The answer to the question is we don't know exactly. But we don't know it now, but we could potentially design a study, and then we could publish an article and change the guidelines and change the practice, change the textbook, and be teaching a different way. And I've also had the fortunate opportunity to be inspired by students asking those fundamental, very, on the one hand, naive, but on the other hand, insightful questions that give the incentive to going into embarking on a research project and changing how things are done. And then we get to that we have different phases in life in our approach to how we view what we're doing and ask ourselves why we're doing. This is me at the age of 3, and that's my mother. That's a little toilet paper roll made out of cardboard that's been cut at a diagonal and taped on a wooden block. It's my dad's dress shirt doubling as a doctor's coat. And I'm apparently inspecting my mom. And not all individuals were born to study medicine and become scientists, nor was I. This picture was in fact shown to me, and I was made aware of it as an adult for the first time after I had graduated medical school, and I did not have any medical doctors in my family. But some people know that they're destined for academic medicine already from an early age. I did not. And there is basically the important message here is that there is no right or wrong answer. Some people figure it out late in life and in their career, others earlier. But there are some components to benefit of an early decision. And that sort of transitions to this next slide. So what do medical doctors regret? And we see here Homer regretting something. And I took the opportunity and the liberty of asking many of the medical doctors that I worked with or was stationed with during medical school. I said, hey, if you were like me, if not omnipotent, then at least pluripotent stem cell like myself, and what would you have done differently? Would you have done anything differently? And an interesting reflection that many people shared, and it was sort of a common theme, was that they said, I would have gotten involved in research earlier in my career. And the fact of the matter is that there is a benefit to starting research earlier, and an imperative to do that if you want to get involved in research ultimately, that exceeds that of necessarily doing clinical training. And by example, there's a classic conversation that occurs in almost every medical school every year. There's a pause, a coffee break between two lectures, and student one says to student two, hey, have you ever thought about potentially getting involved in some research? And the other student responds, yeah, absolutely. It's just that, I want to first find and figure out what I'm going to do as my clinical specialization. And when I'm done with that specialization, that's when I'm going to start doing research. I'm going to do research on what I'm going to become clinically specialized in. And the fact of the matter is that progression of career is exceedingly rare. In fact, if we look at least in Europe and North America, those who get involved in research earlier in their career and their trajectory of education have a tendency to have a greater impact later in their careers. Or rather, if you look at the cadre of senior academics and you ask them, the vast majority started earlier rather than later. They embarked on their research career. So there's an imperative to start doing research training early, because it's first when you have access to the researcher's toolbox and the hammer that is in that toolbox that you come out in a clinical scenario, and all of a sudden you see nails that have not yet been nailed in. And now that you have that hammer and you know how to use it, you can do that. And that's less common when you don't even have a toolbox with a hammer in it, and you're going around and you don't even notice the nails that haven't been adequately hit in. So it boils down to, what do you want to do with your life? So there will be choices, and here we'd have the road less traveled, or at least here the road traveled by car and the road traveled by foot. But finishing up medical school, the vast majority of the people go on to do clinical careers without having an academic research component. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's excellently lovely and very fulfilling careers for many individuals. But I would say that don't do that just because everybody else is doing it, nor should you do research just because of certain people do it. You have to figure out what you want to do and why you want to do it on your own, because there is nothing as important in those career decisions as having the internal motivation. If you have the internal motivation, there are a few things that you cannot accomplish. But if you're doing it for some kind of external reason to make somebody else happy, that's seldom not a recipe for success, or at least not happiness in your career endeavors. So what is important? Is it more important to study a particular subject, in this case maybe obstetrics, with the cesarean section of the small child, the infant, or is it more important to choose a good supervisor? It turns out that science never fails because of the subject matter. A scientific project and a research project and endeavor never fails because the science doesn't work, because in fact, it always does not work. The science never behaves like it's supposed to. It doesn't follow the rule book, and it's all about changing and adapting to emerging new information. And in fact, the projects that do fail, in my experience, are close to 100% when the supervisor and the supervisee don't communicate on the same wavelength, and they're just there's a leadership and communication problem. And that's overwhelmingly the issue with failed research projects, because it is the supervisor's role to adapt, adjust, and handle the challenges and hurdles that are put in place by the ever-changing landscape and the unknown and travels into the unknown future, and adapting to the new findings that we get. And to do that in a way that's supportive of the project and the supervisee. Given that the vast majority of projects fail not because of the science, but rather because of the supervisor, it's really, really important to choose a supervisor wisely. I would encourage you to meet with supervisors, plural, several of them, get a feeling for their persona, your communicative chemistry, if you will, and also not focus 100% on this subject area. That said, if you can combine them both, that's great, but don't focus blindly on the subject matter, because the skills you will be getting in your scientific training are eminently transferable. They can be, you will learn to read scientific literature with a critical eye, structure your thinking, do research design, data collection, data analysis, statistical analysis, drawing conclusions, scientific writing, making figures, tables, presenting your research in writing, presenting it orally in oral presentations, and writing manuscripts. All of these skills are tools that are universal across academic medicine. And I remember myself getting my research training prior to clinical training, but it was research training in a clinical field, happened to be cardiac imaging, and then going on into internship and being exposed to various subjects, including as disparate as psychiatry, and reflecting on myself, could I change my research orientation towards studying psychiatric disorders instead of cardiac disorders? And I remember feeling very confident that, in fact, I could, because I had gotten a good scientific training that wasn't necessarily subject specific. I ended up not doing that for whatever reason, but it's certainly not impossible. And many people I know have done such pivots. So when it comes to healthcare and medical research, on the one hand, we have production of healthcare, which is not unlike a factory. And on the other hand, we have research, ultimately in an ideal situation, leading to recognition with a Nobel Prize. And there are two different things. When we go to medical school, the primary training is to become a clinical doctor, to perform healthcare and treat patients. And that skill set is a different skill set than the research skill set. The research department, if you will, has a different security level on the passcode. In order to get your pass card activated to the production floor of healthcare, you need to go to medical school. In order to get your security card activated to enter research, you also need to get research training, which is different from the clinical training. And there's plenty of opportunities to get that training under the tutelage of a supervisor that is knowledgeable in medical research. But think about it, and don't forget that there are two different skill sets. And if you think you might want to be interested in pursuing both a clinical and a research career, don't forget that involves acquiring both skill sets. So how about becoming an information consumer as opposed to an information producer? On the left-hand side, we have the consumers of information at a conference, for example, listening to a presentation. And we are all, 100% of us, consumers of information. In fact, we're excellent at it. We were maybe best in our school, and we got into medical school. And the consumption of information is something that never will end. We're always doing it, and we thrive on it. However, at a given conference, maybe 10% of the participants will not only be consumers, but they will also be the producers of new knowledge. And science is, in fact, the production of new knowledge. And that's a different skill set. It's a different role. It's the person standing on the stage telling the consumers of information about the new information that they have produced through their scientific endeavors. So if you think that you not only are interested in consuming information, but also producing new information, then a scientific career might also be something for you. How about solving the puzzle versus getting a research education? Solving the puzzle, maybe we can get a Nobel Prize. On the other hand, not everybody gets a Nobel Prize by any measure, nor do they get their research published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But the importance of training in research is getting a proper research education in many times in the form of a PhD. And for me, it was an aha experience when I realized that the four research papers that were going to be covered by my PhD, none of them were going to get a Nobel Prize nor be published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But I came to realize that I, in fact, was getting a good research education and could feel very confident that the skill set that I was getting would be very useful moving forward, almost regardless of what I would do. So don't be so worried about necessarily making the big breakthrough during your PhD training or your initial research training, because very few people do. Over the arc of my career, several hundred publications later now, I've had the opportunity to make some interesting breakthroughs that I'm very proud of, but I feel that the most important skill set that I've gotten is the tools to do sound research. So during a PhD, for example, there's a pre-assessment typically at many institutions where they ask, this was at one institution where I got my PhD in Sweden, is the study design adequate? This is an assessment that's done 3 months prior to the PhD being defended. Is the study design adequate? Yes or no? Are the materials and methods adequately described? Yes or no? Is the data analysis adequately performed? Yes or no? And are the conclusions reasonable in relation to the design, methods, and results? Yes or no? And then they finally say that the PhD defense should be recommended. And note, there is no question here, is the science important and sexy and of that kind? There's no grading of the importance of the science. It's the rigor and the scientific rigor of the science. And that is something that is the essence of it all. One can, unfortunately, do excellently diligent and rigorous science on completely uninteresting and irrelevant questions. Some people choose to do that. Ideally, one would try to apply the rigor of science to important and relevant problems, and that's often the case, but it's not always that the result is groundbreaking. But the important thing is that the groundbreakingness, if you want to call it that, of the results is not a part of assessing the rigor of the science. The rigor of the science lies in the study design, the methods, the data analysis, and having conclusions that are reasonable in relation to these things. So for me, that was also sort of a sigh of relief when I realized I got a really good scientific training, but not necessarily getting it in the top journal the first time around. So in summary, what do you want to do with your life? You can and should not do what other people want you to do. You have to figure out what you want to do. And if that involves combining a clinical career with a research career, I would encourage you to take steps to get involved and get that skill set, because the clinical research skill set is different from the clinical skill set. Now, it's important to choose the supervisor and not the subject. Again, the choice of supervisor is absolutely imperative, because it's the relationship between the supervisee and the supervisor that is the weakest link that most often fails. Not all the time, of course, but I would argue that the importance of the supervisor trumps the importance of the subject matter, because you will learn a skill set that is beyond the subject matter in your research experience. And with that, thank you for listening, and I wish you the best of luck as you move forward.